Hey, welcome to BSP TV. Today, really excited to have Sarah Jane from Liberty Leasing. Now, Liberty Leasing is a little bit different. It's on behalf of tenants. Sarah Jane, tell us a little bit more about you and your background and how you came about having Liberty Leasing.
Yeah, so I guess to start out with what Liberty Leasing is, we are commercial tenant reps and we work with our clients to find the perfect site for their business. But a large part of what we do is negotiate the commercial terms that form part of a lease. And for some of our larger clients who do transaction management type stuff. For me, I spent the last decade working for institutional landlords in a variety of roles, including consulting at some top-tier law firms in Australia. And about 18 months ago, I decided to turn the tables and use that experience to start empowering tenants. And that is what we do at Liberty Leasing.
That's truly fantastic. Now, when I asked you, hey, what are the top 5-6 mistakes that people make, you sent me through a list and we were just talking about it. And I'm so glad because I'd be one of your top clients because I've made every one of those mistakes.
Yeah, and that's why I picked them because they're the most common mistakes. So they are the most common mistakes. But I also picked them because they're the most expensive. They're the most expensive ones to make.
They are. So please watch this really carefully and listen to the tips because if anything rings an alarm bell, we're not going to have time to cover everything off because each of these topics probably should be going for a half-hour webinar anyway. But yeah. Sarah Jane, are you happy for people to give you a call?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as I was saying to you, my philosophy in business and life is be useful or don't bother. So if you walk away feeling a little bit confused but thought it sounded important, I've got an open phone line for tenants and give me a call, send me a message and we'll take it offline.
Fantastic. So let's get straight into it. What's the first one?
Yeah, well, this isn't the first challenge, but we're going to talk about things that are important to put in your heads of agreement. So let's just brush over what that document is. So a heads of agreement or a letter of intent sets out the key commercial terms that are going to form part of the lease. So your outgoings, make good obligations, how market rent's determined. And this is a document that's signed by tenants and landlords, and it is the document that goes to the legal reps, and they use that as a basis for the lease. So whatever is in that is what's going to be in your lease. And why it's so important to have a comprehensive heads is because if you don't, really critical issues like I just mentioned are going to go unnoticed. Or if a tenant's rep, a legal rep does try to negotiate them, they're going to have a really significant difficulty with that because it's already been commercially agreed to. So you're going to have protracted negotiations and it's going to be very expensive.
And everything's going through lawyers, and your expense just went right through the roof. You've probably just spent your entire lease on your lawyer, which we don't want to do. Point number 2.
Yeah, so the point that I wanted to talk about first off is outgoings. So the charges that landlords can recover from a tenant through their lease as a result of owning the building, really. For retail tenants, they're somewhat protected by the retail legislation and the scope of what landlords can recover is limited. But if you're a commercial tenant, there is a lot more flexibility surrounding what landlords can recover from you. So what I want to highlight today is static, so one-off charges versus reoccurring charges.
You just went a little bit robotic there for me. Can you repeat that?
I cut out a little bit. Yeah, so we're going to highlight outgoings that are trying to recover recurring charges versus one-off charges. So some landlords will try to build into their lease an ability to recover one-off charges relating to capital works or completing works as required by local governments. And to illustrate why that is problematic, I had a matter some time ago where commercially they agreed to a really broad outgoings obligation. The landlord got a notice from local government to do some repairs on a drainage system on the land. And because of the way that they had structured the outgoings, the landlord could actually recover an element of those costs through the outgoings. And that's problematic because it wasn't works required as a result of that tenant's use or occupation of the premises. It really just should have been a cost borne by the landlord as a result of holding the asset.
Absolutely. Well, I got smashed on that one with floods of 2011 and different works that had to go on. And anyway.
Mm-hmm. And there's a whole other point in there about insurance premiums and things that you need to think about as well.
Absolutely. What's the second point there?
The second point we want to talk about is market rent reviews. So you'll usually have a market rent review if you have a lease term in excess of 5 years, or if you've got an option term. So the purpose of a market review is to really provide a price correction to the rent to take into account changing property valuations and stuff like that. The lease is going to set out the external factors that need to be included and excluded from that market rent determination. And by default, landlords are going to have their rent review structured so that they are excluding items like rent incentives or fit out contributions that would be available in an open market. And so what that does is that gives you a face rent, and effectively a face rent is an artificially inflated rent that is not reflective of actual market forces.
True scenario, yeah. It's there to artificially inflate the whole value of the building and that sort of stuff.
Absolutely. So you want to structure that determination so that you're capturing what we call an effective rent. And an effective rent is going to take into account those inducements you would receive in an open market and lower your rent quite significantly.
Absolutely. The next point, the third point that we want to, and this is something very, very
close to your heart a little bit, make good obligations. So when we talk about make good obligations, what we mean is the condition that you need to hand back the premises to the landlord at the end of the lease. And it is a provision that's often overlooked by tenants because it doesn't impose an immediate cost to them. But a failure to negotiate it properly is very expensive. As we were talking about, it's $150 to $300 per square metre. So if you've got 300 square metres of office building, that adds up quite quickly.
Yeah, and that's what we're talking about. GFC hit. We are talking a long time ago. All of a sudden, I'm due to move out of a property. I'm getting told by the landlord, "Hey, you owe us $90,000 to move out," and I've gone, "Well, no, I don't." The building had been sold 3 different times during the course of my lease, right? Mm-hmm. And the first landlord were very lackadaisical, very easygoing, really supportive. But the people who owned it when I went to move out were the complete opposite of that. And all of a sudden, they're trying to tell me when I don't have any money that you've got to give us $90,000. So, look, I eventually found someone to do the job to actually take it back for $15,000. I offered them the cash. They said no. I said, great, I'll just take it back to, that.
Yeah. And so I guess, the point I really wanted to illustrate is that landlords will put forward their standard make good obligation, which is going to often be returning a premises back to a bare shell, which is appropriate in very limited circumstances. Usually, we're talking about new developments and stuff like that. So you need to make sure that the make good obligations are appropriate to your circumstances. So if you're taking on existing fit outs and stuff like that, thinking about the age of the building and petitioning and all that kind of stuff, you need to really make it specific. And also, landlords leave make good obligations very broad, and they do that intentionally because it will be interpreted in their favour. So what you want to do is you want to build in a reference point, so a condition report or a dilapidation report, similar things that we see in residential tenancies, to be honest.
And take a truckload of photos when you walk in.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. What's the next point?
So our second last point is flexible lease terms. So, and when I'm talking about flexible lease terms here, what I mean is ensuring that you negotiate early exit strategies into your lease, which is usually a subleasing or an assignment right. I think if 2020 has taught us anything about adaptability, it's that flexible lease terms are really critical, particularly for small businesses and continuing to stay afloat in global pandemics. So it's really important to have those rights. So an assignment of lease is effectively where you sign your interest and the benefit of the lease to a new party. And that is a process that will always require landlord consent. And for different rules, again, surrounding retail and commercial tenants, because they're guided by different legislation. But for commercial tenants, what you want to do is you want to review the conditions in your lease to make sure that the conditions you need to meet to obtain that consent aren't too restrictive. As I mentioned to you, one of the things landlords will try and do is restrict assignments to parties that are going to carry out the same business. And what that does is it basically says you can't assign your lease unless you're selling your business, which is not an effective early exit strategy.
Yeah, you don't want to be in the same premise as a competitor in very many industries. Some might be okay. The other point I want to make there is make sure that if you're doing a sublease, that the sublessees have the exact same make good that you are under obligation for. Otherwise, they'll just walk out the door and go, hey, not my issue.
Yeah, so subleases need to reflect head leases always. And that's an interesting circumstance because generally the subleasing provisions we would see in a lease, landlords actually require that the sublease reflects the head lease. So, yeah, very critical if you're ever subleasing. Absolutely,
make sure. And there's one last thing.
There is one last point, and that is surrounding permitted use. It is a tip that is really aimed at retail tenants. We've been talking a lot about commercial tenants. So a permitted use is what is written in your heads of agreement as your permitted use is what's going to be incorporated into the lease. And your lease is going to say you can't use the premise for any other purpose other than the permitted use. So you need to strike a balance between being specific enough and broad enough. So 2 examples, if you are a cafe and you also sell retail items, so keep cups, coffee beans, we have a client that sells jams and chutneys and stuff like that. You want to ensure that that additional retail activity is incorporated into the permitted use. Because if you just have a permitted use that reads cafe, those additional retail activities aren't going to be captured under the ordinary interpretation of what that means. And then, they put a Woolies in next door and they've got exclusivity to sell certain items, and then it's not in your permitted use and creates a lot of problems. And then in terms of, I guess, being broad enough, if you're a restaurant, landlords will often try and link menu into the permitted use. They're effectively limited to the menu that you had in your lease at the commencement date. You want to avoid this. So I would suggest something like having Japanese restaurant, and then you're limiting it to a cuisine, but you're not linking it back to that menu.
That specific menu, absolutely. See, there's lots of different traps and lots of different reasons why you may need the help of someone like Sherry-Jane Marsh from Liberty Leasing. Thanks for giving us a flyover of some of the challenges. As I said,
so fast, and they are really big topics, but they're really, really important, and they're really important to understand. So if you're a little bit confused, please reach out.
And don't feel silly about reaching out for some expert help in this, because it is such an issue and such an easy issue to make mistakes. As I said, I've fallen foul of many of them throughout, 20 years of owning my own business and having lots of different premises during that time. I kind of learned one issue at a time. Really expensive way of doing it, I've got to say. Much cheaper to go to Sarah-Jane and to have a chat with her.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to chat.
Look, thanks very much for your time. Lovely to meet you, Sarah-Jane. I'll speak to you very soon.
Okay, see you later.